We're continuing in the life of Paul. We are now in Acts chapter 20, and we are at a point where Paul is going to be heading toward Jerusalem. That's what this section really is beginning to show, that he's heading that direction. And we also are going to pick up Luke. We will notice that when we get there. But to begin with, let's just get back where we were. So we'll just start with verse 1. We'll just read these. Acts chapter 20, verse 1. After the uproar had ceased, that's the uproar at Ephesus, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. So he goes from Ephesus, which is in Asia, that's modern-day Turkey, and he goes to Macedonia. We would call that northern Greece, is what we would call that. That's where Philippi is, and Thessalonica and Berea. They are up there. So he knows people there, and Luke is up there. Luke is in Philippi, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But he goes to Macedonia. Now, when he had gone over that region, encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece. So this is summed up very, very quickly as to what he does in that region. How long did that take? We simply don't know. And he came to Greece. Well, what does that mean? Well, last week we said that probably means Achaia. And stayed 3 months. So he's in Greece, or Achaia, for 3 months. And when the Jews plotted against him, as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. We mentioned last week that there probably was a plan to kill him as he's getting on board the ship or while on board the ship, but he's going to Syria. Why would he be doing that? That's because that's his home base. Syria, Antioch of Syria, is his home. If there is a home for him, that's it. That's home base. And he ends all of his missionary journeys, all of his tours, when he gets back to Antioch and tells them the things that were accomplished. And so he was heading to Syria, but he decided to return through Macedonia. So he's got to head north instead of heading east, which would be toward the coast, or be like Tyre and Sidon, or a little bit further north than that, heading to Syria. Instead of doing that, he goes back to Macedonia, and this would have been about 250 miles by sea in doing that. Okay, now we come to these names, and this is one of those few places where we get a list of people who are with Paul. And we don't always get this. And sometimes we think that Paul is alone somewhere. Maybe he is, maybe he's not. But here we see that we have this list of names. So we're going to read it, and we're going to go over each one individually. And Sopater of Berea accompanied him to Asia. So that's as far as he's going to go. He's going to Asia. Also Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. And I'm going to go to verse 5. These men going ahead waited for us at Troas. Now, we have 8 men, 7 of them mentioned by name. The 8th one has to be there by logic. Okay, so we have Sopater of Berea. He's traveling as far as Asia. And he would have been met, Paul would have met him on the second missionary journey in Acts chapter 17, verses 10 through 15. He would have met him. Then we have Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. Well, we also see him that he's with Paul when Paul was a prisoner in Acts chapter 27 and verse 2. He's mentioned as being with Paul. And he's also mentioned in Philemon 1 and verse 24. Okay? And as a fellow prisoner in Colossians 4:10. So Aristarchus is someone who is, he's traveling with Paul. He's with Paul when Paul is a prisoner, and he's also a prisoner. He too becomes a prisoner at some point. So Aristarchus is with him. Now, Secundus of the Thessalonians, also he would have found him. Paul would have met Secundus on his second missionary journey. Presumably, that's where it would have occurred in Acts 17, 1 through 10. Then we have Gaius of Derbe. That would be on his first missionary journey, Acts 14 to 20. Timothy is second missionary journey, Acts 16, 1 through 3. And of course, we know that Timothy traveled with Paul quite a bit. And there were times when Timothy would have to travel by himself. He would be sent back up to Macedonia, to Thessalonica. He might and then return back. And Timothy is one of those that we see is in different places. In 1 Corinthians, that we know that Timothy had been in Corinth. And so Timothy is one of those that Paul might send or might go on his own without Paul sending him anywhere, might go on his own. But he is indispensable. I'm not saying that the rest of them are dispensable, not at all. But Timothy has proven himself to be extremely faithful. Now, before we go any further, I want us to make mention that notice already what we have discovered. We have men who are from the first missionary journey. That's when they're converted. Or as a result of that first missionary journey, second missionary journey, and third missionary journey. Now this is individuals who are saved because of the work that Paul was involved in. Because Paul went to a place like Philippi, now we have those who are from Philippi. Because he went to Derbe, or because he went to Thessalonica, we see where now you have faithful brethren who are there, who are accompanying him. And this is astonishing, actually. It's an astonishing thing, and it shows the work that he's been doing in this, and that these are faithful brethren because of the work that Paul did. Now they are going with him, and these are both those who are Jews and Gentiles. They're with him. Now we have, following Timothy, Tychicus, and we see him in places like Colossians 4:7, Ephesians 6:21, 2 Timothy 4:12. He's being mentioned by Paul. Now the next one, Trophimus of Asia. Now, he is the one that was with Paul in Jerusalem. Now others were with him in Jerusalem, but this is the one that the Jews saw Paul with. All right, Trophimus of Asia, he is a Gentile. And when they saw Paul, the Jews saw Paul in the temple, since they had been seeing him around town with Trophimus, they assumed that Trophimus was in the temple with Paul, in a section that Gentiles cannot be. Now, let's just explain this for a second. In the temple complex was massive. It was really this extraordinary place where you could have gatherings of thousands of people in a certain area. And you wouldn't be crowding the place. There's plenty of room. I'm talking about not the temple itself, but the temple complex. The temple complex. that you could have people, and I'm one that believe, I cannot prove it, but I'm one that believes that the sermons on the day of Pentecost were at the temple complex. And that is where you have about 3,000 who obey the gospel. They heard him there. The temple is a huge place. Now, as a Gentile could enter the complex. Not a problem at all. Not at all. And that you could have Romans such as Cornelius go into the complex. And you could have anybody go into the complex. But there was in the complex, and when I'm talking about a complex, I mean it's a wide open area. Think of enormous castle walls, and inside large spaces. In the middle of this, you actually have the temple itself. Okay, on the outer part of this huge courtyard, you would have porticos. They would be covered areas where a teaching would go on. Then you would have into the open area where anyone can be there. But then you have evidently a small barrier, you could think of it like a fence or a small wall, and there were little areas to get through that wall. Okay, it's not very big at all, but there were signs there that if you are a Gentile and you get on the other side of this wall, okay, your life is forfeit. You will die if you do that. Happy to have you over here, but don't you dare come over here. Okay, this is only for Jewish men. Okay, you don't get over here. You don't come over here. You stay on this side, and all is well. Well, they thought that Paul, who could rightfully cross that line, he was a descendant of Abraham, and they knew it. He's of Benjamin, and they knew it. He had every right to cross over, but they thought he had Trophimus with him. Now, we'll get to that later. And that caused an enormous uproar and considered Paul being guilty of leading Trophimus in there. And so we also have Trophimus in 2 Timothy 2:20 as being sick in Miletus, being mentioned there to Timothy. And now, that's 7 men, so who's the 8th man? We see that when we come down to verse 5, these men going ahead, waiting for us at Troas. So who does that include? It includes Luke. Luke is there. He doesn't mention himself as being there except using the word us. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about Luke. Luke is here. And they're in Macedonia, but they are in Philippi, because he says in verse 6, but we sailed away from Philippi. We did that. Okay, so they're in Philippi. Now, just a brief thing concerning Luke. I know this isn't the life of Luke, but it is of note. Luke does not travel with Paul like Barnabas did or Silas did, is starting from the beginning. All right, Barnabas and Paul on the first missionary journey, they start out from Antioch and they return back to Antioch. All right, with the second missionary journey, it's Silas. Silas, they start off at Antioch and go on. But with Luke, they meet Luke in Troas. And he travels with them over the Aegean, into Macedonia, and we lose track of him at Philippi. So it would appear as though either he stayed in Philippi or went somewhere else, but whatever it was, he does not include himself in all the events that happened after Philippi. Yes, ma'am?
He's a Gentile, right?
He's a Gentile,
And he
yeah.
couldn't go into that area either, could he?
No, No, nor could a proselyte for that matter. Okay? A proselyte couldn't do that. It was only for those direct descendants of Abraham, and a Samaritan couldn't do it. Okay? It's those that had the genealogy and it was provable that in now, did anybody sneak across just because they could? I don't know. I mean, yeah, prove that I'm not a Jew. Well, I'm sorry, you have to prove that you are. Okay, and that would be essential. That it's not innocent until proven guilty. It's you've got to prove that this is what you are.
So what kind of, were they getting some kind of teaching there?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, there was that. This is where you would have individuals like Gamaliel teaching here, and other rabbis would teach in the temple complex. That's where, now they could very well teach anywhere else, but that was a place where you could have large crowds, and literally you could have a large class over on this side, large class over on this side, and they would not bump into each other. They wouldn't disturb each other. This is a big, big place.
And they're teaching the law of Moses.
Oh yeah, they're teaching basically whatever it is they want to teach. It could be the law of Moses and the doctrine of these rabbis. The various sects that one could have found there. And there could also be among them zealots that is absolutely political. Okay, they could be there as well, rightfully be there. And let me tell you about the dirty Romans and how we need to get rid of them. They could be in there as well. The temple complex was a place where there was a lot of activity that went on there, and that just like Ephesus goes to the theater, so too those of Jerusalem could go to the temple, and there could be these assemblies that could be there, and you could have lots of people in the temple complex, not the temple itself. And of course, the temple itself is for priests only, and that's another thing. If you're not a Levite, and you're not a Levite who's a priest, because that makes a difference. One could be a Levite and not a priest. Or it's not your time to be in there. There's going to be questions as to why you're even here. It's by courses, and like we see with Zechariah in the book of Luke, that it's by, is it Luke? I think it is. Now that I'm thinking about it. Yes, it's in Luke. Zechariah is a priest, and he's there. It was his course. It was his time to be there. Okay, now let's get back to Luke. Luke joins Paul in Troas. That's where we pick him up. It's in Troas in Acts chapter 16, verse 10. First place where we see that first person plural of we or us. That's the first time we see it. And he's being accurate that he, the writer, is with Paul, or with the action. Whatever's happened is with the action. Now, if he's not part of the action, he doesn't put himself, there is no we or us in it. It would be Paul did this, or it could be they discussed this, but if he's part of the action, he puts it in as we. And so we pick him up at Troas. He goes with them to Philippi, and we lose track of him there. Now, does Luke stay in Philippi? We don't know. When he's being picked up here, again in chapter 20, years have transpired from chapter 16 now to chapter 20. Years have transpired. That was the second missionary journey. Paul is now finishing up his third missionary journey. There's been a number of things that have occurred in that time. And Philippi was not toward the end of the second missionary journey. You have the rest of the second missionary journey, and then Paul going back to Antioch and things happening there before he goes on the third. So years have transpired. Has Luke remained in Philippi? We have no answer in that. Luke could have gone wherever Luke wanted to go. Okay, but we are picking him back up in Philippi. So it would seem as though he stayed there, but I can't give you an answer. Because there's one thing that we can see in this is that people were mobile. All right, people were mobile. That how many places can we put Timothy at? I couldn't answer that. It would take me a while to look at the scriptures and show the different places where he's mentioned as being. Someone like Paul, someone like Priscilla and Aquila, which we've discussed before, someone like Apollos, and the fact, as we just finished Romans chapter 16, how many people in Rome knew these other people either personally or by name? And the only way that can happen is somebody's got to be mobile around here. And somebody's got to either travel with these names and speak of them, or those people have to travel one way, one direction or another for them to even meet up to know each other. So they are very mobile, and even someone like Peter, who we think of as remaining in Jerusalem, which he did, but he also traveled. He went to Galatia. And we know that from the book of Galatians. Aside from the fact of helping Philip in the villages of the Samaritans, aside from that, he goes up into the region of Galatia at some point in his life. Now, Luke, it appears, stays in Philippi, and we pick him up again here in chapter 20, verse 5. Now, Luke writes the book of Luke before he writes the book of Acts. And we can clearly see that to be the case. All right, first off, let's go to Luke chapter 1, verse 1. And so we will see that it is the case. Luke writes Luke first, then continues into the book of Acts. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. So, Luke has been instructed from eyewitnesses, because he's saying that just as though who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers to the word delivered them to us. Okay, he heard from individuals who saw. Peter would still be alive. John would still be alive. James, unless somehow Luke had met James earlier, James would have been executed. But he can go and he can speak to the eyewitnesses. And of course, Paul is an eyewitness, not of the life of Christ here on the earth, but he is an eyewitness of Christ because he's met on the road heading to Damascus, and Christ also speaks to him at different points in Paul's life, such as when he's in Corinth. Christ speaks to him, and you have visions that he is given. But now we go to Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1, and we can see clearly it's the same author, and he's continuing on in the events of this historical narrative. Where he left off in the book of Luke, now he continues in the Acts. So Acts 1, verse 1, the former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. Okay, so that the former account, that means he did the book of Luke, now he's doing the book of Acts. Okay, he's continuing on. Until the day in which he was taken up, after he, through the Holy Spirit, had given commandments to the apostles whom he had chosen. Okay, now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because Luke has to be, if he says he was taught by eyewitnesses, he's got to be among the eyewitnesses, or the eyewitnesses have to be among him. Paul does not count as an eyewitness except for the things that Paul saw. But Paul wasn't at the crucifixion. If he was, he never said a thing about it. He wasn't there with the announcement from Gabriel. But Mary was. And Mary could still be alive. Very much so. But Theophilus is going to have to be among... not Theophilus. Luke is going to have to be among the eyewitnesses, and it is possible that Luke will be among those eyewitnesses when we get to Acts 21:17, and he is with Paul and they enter Jerusalem. It's possible that the book of Luke is not going to be written until after that point, after they're in Jerusalem. And they're going to be in Jerusalem for a while because Paul's going to be arrested. Then there's going to be a time period. It's not brief. There's going to be a time period. Paul's going to be under the care of the Roman governor. He's a prisoner, but he's protected by Rome. And that's a period of time. And this would be a point at which Luke could do all the research he needs. Now, he's an inspired writer. I'm not saying he's not. But he said, taught to us, given to us, and that he would be among eyewitnesses at this time. Whether any of them had gone to Philippi, I can't answer, but he goes to Jerusalem, so they don't have to go to Philippi. But he is there at this point, and it's possible that the book of Luke begins at that point, and then later he's going to write the book of Acts. After he finishes Luke, he's going to write the book of Acts. All of it inspired. And some of it in the book of Acts, he is included, and he rightfully includes himself in this. Now, back to Acts chapter 20. And I want to make mention that Luke is with Paul during that whole period of where he's in Jerusalem, he's made a prisoner, and then he is going to be put on a boat as a prisoner to sail to Italy. Luke is there with him. He's with him that entire period. Staying, and he's not a prisoner, but he's staying close by. And there's a number of things to say concerning that Luke has still got to eat, and so it's very possible that Luke would have continued to be a physician wherever he went, and could have been a physician while in Jerusalem practicing. Yes, ma'am.
So a person could have been an inspired writer but did not have miraculous gifts.
Right? Yes, yeah. The question is, could someone be an inspired writer and not have other gifts, other miraculous gifts? And the answer is yes. One could. He was a doctor, yes. But he was a doctor prior to, or I can only assume, prior to becoming a Christian. Though I really can't answer that question. I don't know if he was or wasn't. But He is a physician. And understand that even Paul tells Timothy, there were certain things, Paul's thorn in the flesh, he couldn't heal that. And Christ wasn't going to let him. And Timothy evidently had trouble with his stomach, and Paul gives him medical advice. He doesn't say you've got the power to heal yourself, because there are times when, could Paul heal others? Yes, he could. But there are times when God says no, and says no to very, very faithful people. He says no, and he has he has the right to say no, and he has a very good reason to say no. And always understand that. While I might dislike the decision greatly, I don't know why it was made. And it's always, always with my good and other people's good in mind. Always. And a different lesson, yes. But that is true. That just because you're an inspired writer, one, doesn't mean you're going to remain faithful. Two, it also doesn't mean you know exactly what you wrote down in the meaning of what you wrote down. It doesn't mean that. You know what you were supposed to put down, and it could be as much of a mystery to the one who was the inspired writer as it would be to the rest of us reading it and have no idea. I think there were plenty of things that David would have written down, or Isaiah would have written down, that in Ezekiel, that they didn't quite know what the extent of that meaning might be. But they're human. Yeah. And Paul speaks of a mystery from the beginning. It's spoken of and given. This mystery is spoken of by the prophets, but that doesn't mean the prophets knew the answer to that mystery. It doesn't mean that. And also, the angels didn't know. It's the things that angels wanted to look in. They were not given privileged information that the rest of us were not given. They're not given that. Not when it comes to Scripture. Not when it comes to this. Okay, so these, verse 5 again, these men going ahead waited for us at Troas. Now, we have the 7 men, starting with Sopater and ending with Trophimus. They're not going to remain, they're not staying with Paul. They're basically traveling together ahead by way of ship to Troas, which is going across the Aegean again from Philippi, now across to Troas on the other side. Why did they go ahead of him? And we don't know why. These travel to Troas and they wait for Paul, but we're not given the reason why. And there could be a multitude of reasons, but we're not told what it is. Verse 6, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. So, they sail from Philippi. It's after the days of unleavened bread. That would be what? That's Passover. Okay. That's Passover. So he's telling us the time of year that this was done, and so this would be in the spring of the year. And heading that direction anyway, in the spring of the year. And of course, Passover is one of those that's a floating date. It's not a specific date on the calendar. It floats. So the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. So they are, it is possible to interpret this as being 5 days on the water from Philippi to Troas. It's very possible to interpret that way. And if it is, that would have meant that they had difficulty as far as speed is concerned in getting across from Macedonia to Troas, because on a good day, we calculated it wouldn't take near that long to do that. But there's bad weather, and there's weather that's less than ideal for traveling by sail across water. It's possible that this is telling us that this took 5 days to cross, and that's a possibility. All right. Now, where we stayed 7 days. So once they get over to Troas, they stay 7 days there, and now we come to the first day of the week. They are there on the first day of the week. So there is a church at Troas. Now in Acts chapter 16, Paul goes to Troas on his way to Macedonia. That's where he picks up Luke. Did he start the church there in Acts chapter 16? Did he start the church in Troas in Acts chapter 16? Acts 16 doesn't tell us. But as we've already stated, the book of Acts does not tell us every little thing, every place he went. It doesn't, even though that might not be considered a little thing. No, it's not. But somebody taught at Troas, because there's a church at Troas. So one way or another, the church has been established there, and just so happens Paul passed through there in Acts chapter 16. Did he plant the seed? I'd find it hard to believe he didn't. He knows he's going to Macedonia. He knows that. But does that mean he cannot plant the seed as he goes to Macedonia? No, it doesn't mean that. But one way or another, the church is in Macedonia. So the church is in Troas. So verse 7, now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. We see where this is shown what they were doing. And it's what we call an approved example. And it's showing us the pattern of the first century church. That this is what they did. And they're not the only ones doing this. We see Paul speaking to the church at Corinth of them coming together on the first day of the week. We see that happening also earlier in the book of Acts, where this is happening, that they're getting together. Okay? And so they're coming together on the first day of the week, because that is when the church comes together for this purpose. Now, we see here they came together to break bread. Now, that's known as a Synecdoche. I have a hard time saying that word. Let me, instead of saying the word, because I get it all twisted with that town in New York, Synecdoche. It is a term which means we use a portion of something to mean all of something. Okay? We use a portion. And we do it all the time. Or it's not uncommon. We'll just say that. It's not uncommon. That we use a portion meaning everything. Okay? So if someone were to talk about having a new car, they might say, I got a new set of wheels. And you could say, well, did you get new tires? No, I got a new car. That's what they meant. Okay, we do it a lot. And one may ask, or one may say that according to the White House, all right, well, that would mean basically government, or at least the executive branch is what that would mean. And we put it down to, just one term there, meaning the all of it. But the breaking of bread does mean, now it can mean two things. I will grant that. I don't deny that. But they came together on the first day of the week. That's combined with to break bread, and that means what? What are they doing? It is the Lord's Supper. It's communion. That's precisely what they're doing. They're getting together and they're worshiping God on the first day of the week, and they're taking communion together, which is what communion, by the way, means. There's so many terms. The word church or ecclesia, the word communion demands that the Christians are coming together to do this. That's what those words mean. And obviously, if one is the only Christian in a certain place, then you are the gathering, and you are the sum total of Christians. That's the way it is. Hopefully, that's not the way it is for long. But otherwise, you get together with Christians and do this. Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples, so we know who it is, who's doing it. It's the disciples, so the church is there, came together to break bread. That's when they're doing this. This is an approved example. Paul does not condemn them for doing this or ask, why are you even doing this? This is what was expected of them. Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. And I will say what I know every preacher says. If you think I preach too long, okay, you would have a problem with Paul, okay? Because I have yet to do this, and I'd fall over with exhaustion. I'd just collapse. But yeah, that's right. Well, I'd stomp and rant and get you back and throw objects. But he speaks to them in a message until midnight. And this is getting late. Now, having not met Paul, but I would say that if I knew Paul was coming to my town, Paul being an apostle of Christ, an inspired writer and speaker, I'd want to hear him. And if he wants to continue to midnight, that'll be okay. If I fall asleep, it's not because I wanted to. Okay. Yeah. And here's also one of those lessons that you need to learn. You don't want to fall asleep because of what happens. All right. Now, verse 8, there were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. So we find from this verse, well, it's dark. We would have already come to that conclusion because it's at midnight. And we also know it's in the spring of the year anyway. We already know that. But this is one of those things, those little details of there were many lamps. It was well lit inside this upper room. And that's another detail. It's in an upper room, which is going to explain what happened. I guess it might have been. I don't know what the weather could have been like in Troas at that point in time, but it is the Mediterranean, so it could very well be quite warm. But you've got all these lamps going to light the place, which gives us insight into first century life. That's the way. It wouldn't be just a couple of lamps. It would be numerous lamps in here. Now, verse 9. And in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into deep sleep. he was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. So this upper room, we don't know how far it is until now. An upper room could just mean second floor, but this is third floor. And he's sitting in the window. He falls asleep and falls out backwards. And the words, and we're going to need to end it here, but the words "was taken up dead" does not mean assumed dead or taken for dead. It does not mean that. It means he was dead. They took him up dead. And so we'll need to stop there and continue next week. And appreciate everybody being with us. And I am enjoying the life of Paul greatly. And hopefully we can continue next time. Thank you.